Okay, welcome back from tea. Tasha Delay. So my name is Megan Cole, and I'll just give a brief introduction to myself.
Megan Cole is
So I grew up in the United States in a city called Baltimore. It's very close to the capital of Washington, D.C.
Baltimore Washington
I went up to somewhere cold for college, up to Massachusetts. In college, I studied biology and also computer science, and I discovered I loved them both and wanted to combine them.
Computer science
After college, I went to continue my studies at a place called Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT.
Massachusetts Institute of Technology
And I studied biology, and specifically I looked at embryonic stem cells, so the cells that will grow up to become a person.
MIT embryonic stem cells
And I studied how proteins interact with the DNA to turn genes on and turn genes off to control the fate of those cells. In the United States, MIT is a very famous school for having excellent students who are very intense and serious. But even our most serious students still have a sense of humor. So MIT is also famous for their student jokes that they play. So these are some of the jokes that students have done in the past. They've taken a car and assembled it on top of MIT's famous building, and they did it in one night, nobody knows how, and they could not figure out how to get the car down. They had to bring a helicopter to do it.
MIT loktu denzo khari chirlana chop langi lara koranzo na loktu no kunzo chenjigla khari chirlana motor jig tanda kunzo gi tanda khangba chimbusto li gang la shares shawara ani ma pabe di khande pa boy me ha ma ko ani koranzo jela tanda helicopter khini ma pa bo kheres motor di.
When new Star Wars movies came out, they made the dome, again the famous building on campus, to look like R2-D2.
Yang kunzo khari chirla ina loktu denzo gi Longin Jora Star Wars land dinala ni pil chak mi do da chuje mi so shedo dende do jani khangba de dende robot do so shares chuje mi do.
And one time they took control of the lights in this building and made it so that they could play Tetris on it, a video game with the bricks falling down and you have to arrange them.
The themaji lokdo denzo khari chorla na di khangba thosh da those mangbu chodi di lo denzo koran so tangjin chira lo denzo gyo ta ni dosta to gal ngonzo chimuchi ya game ere game che to gal saba saya da india dinde dige doji social response.
So all students, even the most serious, need to have fun too. After that, I went and did more research at Georgia Institute of Technology, and then I went to Emory University, where I now teach.
So Georgia Tech Emory University.
So I think I have even had some of you in my lab classes, and I'm sorry if you did not enjoy them. So now I teach at Emory. I teach biology classes, and I study how students learn.
Quran so chula lomni khana la kenguri ba ma chinda di thi yes.
Outside of my work, I have 2 daughters and a husband.
Ta lega di pha shawaina di tha di lannu be ni khari yolauna nangmi chashana kyoga yes ra sanda di che ani pomoni yes.
We like to go skiing, we love the snow, we like to go hiking, we like to be outdoors a lot.
Ango chilo la doya go yes ani khangi la doya da ri gal zaya da di go yes nangmi.
We also have a dog, Charlene, who we love to spoil.
Ta ango kiji yes nang la Charlene res khura mila. Ango ko jambu shu chini.
And this is me taking my daughters to a political rally, the Women's March, after our recent elections.
Dilo dita tanda pime sama zom neta da ma khumru che jura digap sani ngara doy kap super gya sharins pomuni nyam dudi.
Yes, trying to teach them to be good global citizens.
Dilo du ngara miseri abu ji che gi thapshi che.
And it's only fair if we make you Since we're making you share your animals, I thought I would share my animal.
Ta kiran zo simje kor la share ras diro ngara ya ta simje ni kor share insra.
I sometimes am a little lazy, and I like to sit out. I would love to just be a lizard and sit out on a rock and soak up the sun all day long.
Ma tis nyopto chelulu ro de go yes cheza ani sangba jele di na she di do gala de nima tu chin de go yes.
So we'd like to have a few more people introduce yourselves, and there's no hiding in this classroom. We want everyone to participate. So we're going to go with the back row. If you could introduce yourselves, your animal, and why you would like to be that animal.
cheza modu she di sangma jinda chazang chi wu res lo bu sangma ni ta quran to sar sos ta gyam ni das modu she di so so ning da ani simje khari chinda yobi di
마라미가 로선이 된다고 했어. 아니 정말 그걸 кин도 자리 예스로. 이게 예스나 터치 메리 깨고 있나? 아니 라고로 다 신경 양중 이 장이 있는 게 있어.
Okay, his name is Lobsang Yonten. So he said like I don't want to be reborn as an animal, but if there is no way, I would love to be some peaceful animal and intelligent like a rabbit.
Oh.
아라미나 다와레기나 네 내가 감사 가오지라 길에 가고 있어 가르스나 그 영신 좀 지라는지 무시해도 병원서 소소스 되는
So he wants to be panda. Gelatsen la khare. Dawa, his name is Dawa. He wants to be panda because he is peaceful and he sits alone and do not disturb other animals. Gelatsen la khare. Pinso. His name is Pinso. He wants to be a snake because like all the creatures run away from the snake.
이비라 계산 무슨 유예 이제 나라 숨지 꽤 누구 여기야
His name is Kyasang Nima. He wants to be a giraffe.
Giraffe. Yeah.
가르치 내서 gel라. 기차를 기린 가르친 첸도 dos.
꽤 무시보다
Because giraffe has a long neck so that he can see everywhere.
That's my daughter's favorite animal.
네 부모야 기차를 기린 라 go 이래서.
마라미가 스킬도
딱 말아 따라. 딱 쉬어. 딱. 균체. 가르치래. 균체 가르쳐. 고마스. 딱 가르치니 gel라 균체. So I want Ling Karlasa. Okay, his name is Children and he wants to be a horse because he feels that horses are foolish. He's Tashi to both of you and his name is Kyalsang Dorji.
Kyalsang Gyaltso.
Kyalsang Gyaltso.
Maruta sirla boyes. Darla bayina ko kechon tsorangi ji, ma kechon tsorangi ji.
So his favorite, he wants to be a rhinoceros because it lives in solitary. So I like to live isolated. So. So his name is Losel Dorji. So he wants to be a deer because deers lives in mountains, so he likes mountains.
Okay. And last one for today's session. Do you all want to hear what Karma would want to be?
Nga khari chinde me ha khundu delas. Koala.
A koala?
Yeah, because I love to sleep.
Or a sloth?
Yeah, go you le osin nyingi simji jura di ming line ba. Koala le.
Okay, so sometimes in science, a new theory comes about that is so big, it changes the way that we perceive the world.
Tang anzu gi zamling thonda laura tang nang di ani anzu theory khashi namsha khashi shu chumbu shu jures di tanang di jo dre di jures.
Evolution is such a theory. It completely changed the way that we view the world and our place within it.
Dila du tanda namsha khashi shu chumbu shu yor la jura di cha sha na tanda anzu phelgyu gi namsha di cha di jures. Di ngaran su nesa gi sa di che de hanan shi ngaran su gi zamling tadang jura di bet manda roji tadang cha di jures phelgyu gi namsha ta oina.
And when theories this big and this important come about, people want to see a lot of evidence to do such a drastic change to their view.
Tanang dile gyo tang gor la du hopta me gyo shuk chumbu tang du wala Quran so pangda mangbu gugu rest dila capture chela.
When Darwin published his idea of evolution, many scientists immediately accepted it because it made so much sense and it made the world make sense to them.
Dila du galta Darwin gi Quran phelgyur gi namsha ma pel ra di tam du gala ani cheribo mangbu methun chires khaina na khol len thuya dinde thanda manju chigden na jodan jura di seo shu cha ani Quran su gi methun chires mulen chires di.
But other people were not so quick to adopt it because they were uncomfortable with evolution. Because with evolution, humans were no longer unique and special. Humans were related to all the other animals.
Khashi gi khele mulen cheyo mares khais na Quran su kharchi gi lana mi la di do mi la di mixe da kheba wa shu ji ba si yores an thanda nganju phelgyur gi namsha shi oina simje samachik da chik dewa cha dir lan shi yoras chezang khonju gi mulen chiyo mares.
So scientists had to gather a lot of evidence to convince everyone of the truth of evolution. And luckily, there is a lot of evidence that supports it.
Chezang da changma mulen chi tuya da di chedu pangda gu yores nganju phelgyur gi thanda pangda shi oina pangda mangbu shi yores.
So we'll go through some of that today, starting with the fossil record.
Da di pangda dinen thambo go chuksa di nganju gyurdo ni go chuk yes pangda gyurdo pangda ni.
So fossils can be formed when animals die and are buried in sediments in the rock.
Ta gyurdo di khande chagor lawana semje di thanda sai wala nem shara an thana shi thanda thawdo da dindi wal nem shani dindi ni go chugu rest chaya.
Just like everything in life, rocks cycle. They are born when rivers wash sediments into the ocean, and those rivers are washing away sediments from other parts of the rock record.
Ta thawdo de khande chagor lawana thanda dodang yo rest gyurim gyukshugi theni ani chema da de sama chukhile an chala chama rubru chi chala thawdo chaya dindi dodang dindi dugu rest.
And as the earth changes, sometimes it pushes some of that buried rock up so that we can observe it.
Kabre kharchi urlauna sawala nem shagota sawala yo lawra dinde tha denjo khachi urlauna gangla sai mu ba thwe dinde yungu res.
Other times, rivers carve their way through rocks and expose layers of rocks for us to see.
Kabre khachi urlauna gyukshu denjo dini ma do gyuk de hoina tha denjo dichini darne ani dini ni 세우 통해 요 장도 된 통해 요 데데 차기 요레스.
And when you look at large pieces of rock, you can go backwards in time, where the uppermost layers were formed recently, and as you go lower, these layers were formed a long, long time ago.
더 장도 된조 따와 인데스. 데니 마 두르와스 강디 카리 숭교 라나 사르쇼 차교디 숭교 요레스. 데니 마마마 드로이나 닝로 두고 요레스. 당쇼 차교디다 된조 차도레스 데니 사르 두고 요레스.
So to look back in time and see how our species have evolved in our past, we can look to some of these lower layers and travel back in time to see those animals.
Dilo duta nyerik denzu duwa khande drawer la jora ngema khande yore nyerik denzu lan ta go na dene ne thawdo dene ni ma drawer na nyerik mindo nyi yores.
Tibet has a famous place where scientists like to search for fossils.
Dilo du phela saja yores dela khariyor la na cheriba denzu gyurdo gala shimju nang yores.
And Marge has actually brought in a fossil for everybody to see today.
Ani March Kurangi thanda gyurdo ji khiyores ti thinda changmal tengu res ma.
My sons know I like these kinds of things, and I always wanted to find my own and never did. So I'm still looking, but they give me presents. So these are trilobites, and I'll just leave it out here we can see. And I also have earrings that are these ancient fossils of trilobites and seashells both. So I'll have them all out here, and we can look at them anytime.
Ta thanda gyurdo chik de do chido di yes Angela Keronto sina tigres ngepu yang gyurdo go yes and di mayamba thanda.
You can see though that there's layers of mud that have turned to rock. This animal is stuck here, and even underneath you can see patterns of plants that were under the sea.
Ta di gaso nala di dam yora damba de zo de la jar yu jo chi thana shi di gan la semjin ji busin ji yores ra and di wall cha shawena gyurdo khari yor sewena di wall chi sing ri yora gaso nala tendi yores.
So that trilobite is an animal that would have lived in the sea and scurried around on the floor.
Thanda trilobite la di thanda semjin di gaso nala yores wala and di gaso gi ngoi laura da wala sai ngoi jora digala ni dongi cha de yores.
And when scientists find fossils, they're able to reconstruct what that animal looked like.
Ani thanda gyurdo gala khari thongur lawana ta thanda dinala tredo sto dige ani semje di khande jyor la di thongu res gyurdo gala.
So they can, from the shape of the bones and the width of the bones, infer how much muscle mass was around them.
Ta thanda di nala khari thongur lawana rube gi ta cheze laura tinde da dilata ni ani semje di nyema shane khaga syona lai jora di ani ngazu hakutu res dilata ni.
From the shape of their teeth and their jaws, they can infer what that animal may have eaten.
Ta semje de jugi soda dende gi je shul haira dene ni khari haku lawana semje di nyema khade da ji sayona lai jora di haku res.
Yes, if it was a hunter and ate animals, or if it was a scavenger and ate plants.
Dilo duta Kuranzo shase ina yana chase ina die hagu res ko diltani.
Sometimes we get lucky and find a really wonderful fossil that's well preserved, like this one that has impressions left behind from feathers.
Ta thanda khase di ro chasha ina dela shujil ha dos di khari shu ro chungur la ina thanda chado yo tinde chungur res.
So as scientists look back in time, did that change? Yeah, that's good. They can see, as they go farther back in time, the change in the fossils and the change in that organism as it evolved.
Dilo do gyurdo latani an chiri padin jo khari nigir la ina simjen di thujo rimbe gala ni Kuranzo yo 100 do gyurdo latani shigir res.
So here, scientists believe that this very ancient dinosaur-like creature slowly evolved to be smaller, and it developed its wings more and more to become more like a bird.
Dilo du cheri boy khari shigir la ina dosta du tumru drawe simjen ju yo che di thujo ma do gala ni shokwa do chajela ni shokwa di yarge abu to yo dinde jo do dan di khonzo ni res.
Familiar animals to us that we may know now as the horse, when we look back in older rocks and we see their fossils, we can see how the horse has changed and evolved over time.
Dila do ngara ju thande thon de gi ta yorwa di resti Ani thakdo ni thanda ma yurdo la tadu gola tuju ma droina dodang dinde jires. Dinde ni yures.
So it used to be quite small, and as it evolved, it got larger and larger.
Ngoma tari judo de chunju yures. An tuju ma do gola ani chero do yo chai res injidi.
It used to have unique toes on its feet, but as it evolved, they slowly melded into what we now see as a hoof.
Tanda nyama im chashaoina tanda tagi sukdi dinde jures. Jela ta pelgyu dugi chido ani tingsan ta waina dinde yures. Di pelgyu drodang di yures.
So from the fossil record, we can see the animals evolve over time.
Dila du tanda nganzu gyurdo gi tanda ta nyesha ju na tawainas an tuju rimbe gala semjen de juwa khande droy me di thongures.
When we look in very, very ancient rocks, we see different animals than we see today. So in these most ancient rocks, you don't see any humans.
Ta nangamu thawdo jura dinde na tawaina gyurdo mindo ash thongures. Ta gang lewana ani nganzu drowa mi gi tanda rubal hamada dinju thongures. Di mana ngamu na tawaina drowa mi yo mares gyurdo na di thawdo na.
In ancient rocks, you don't even see any animals like we know today, such as fish that have a spine and all these bones.
Ta nangamu semjin tanda di thawdo dina ni gi lara nangamu thawdo na tawaina thengdu thoya yo nganzu nyari dinde yo mares.
But as we go forward in time, we begin to see human-like creatures that as we get closer and closer to modern day, become more and more like humans.
Ta dine ya droinas ta dinju do cha shawaina dro mi da nyeve dawe ne socha dinju gyurdo dinju thonggu res and dine ya droina ni tanda thengdu mi dro mi di cha de ros.
So Darwin, on his great voyage, not only was he looking at all the animals alive today, but he would also look at the fossils from the different places he visited.
Dila du Darwin korangi shimju na gapsu korangi koryu na la simjin khari du ta session da dinde chikbu la shimju che chikbu mahimba che gyurdo denzo la korang shimju na res.
And he saw different places had different fossils, but he saw that the fossils of one place looked similar to the animals alive in that same place.
Dila du ta korangi gyurdo tanda ta je shimju chisa jora di ne khaw khasa le che res. Ine korangi khari nye la na ne chigla gyurdo nye jo jora di ani korangi tanda sajal yo smj korang tu jo yo smj di da ani gyurdo di daw yo da sung yo dende shni res.
And that observation is what inspired Darwin to think of the idea of evolution, where the animals and the species that we see today evolved from something similar but slightly different a long time ago.
Ani korangi khari she or la ina thengdu ta korang tu jo go so nye wes tanda yo smj di ani nyema thangbo go chu du dende jo res la ni ra this chikbo chikya mai ba che ine daw yo chi dende chik pelgyu do yo dende shni res.
This is an actual page from Darwin's real journal. He always kept careful notes, sort of like a diary, on his 5 years of his journey.
Ta tanda longa ringa la Darwin korang dimju na res shimju na res lan shera di gap so ani korang gi thisha jo mangbu jo res di Darwin korang gi thisha we chik cha de res di yigide.
This is the page from his journal where he had the idea of evolution.
Ta tanda di korang gi tön shawe na la tanda pelgyur gi samsi jora di dinal tön res.
You can see he wrote, I think. He had just this idea of how it could be.
Ta korang gi khari thior la ina kangla I think nge samgu du la jora di thior res korang gi samsu di ma tön she res dina.
And he drew this picture to depict his idea, where here this would be one species living, a different species living, a different species living, such as all of the different finches on the islands that he visited.
Ta tanda denzo chik chungu da di khari chungu la na nyeri chik and di nyeri shemba di chungu res an korang tanda cha sha na cha ji tön so cha kukta rig ji da dende rig di chungu na shi di nyeri chik che di kukta rig shemba dende chungu res di rimudi.
And he had the idea that all those different finches on the Galapagos Islands started with one ancestor finch that flew its way onto that island.
Tanda cha kukta ji da Galapagos choling na la yo na shi nyeri mindo mangbu di thangbo go chuk du nyeri chik imba di ani korang gi tön res.
And that one type of finch species over a long period of time separated and made itself different into the different species that we can see today.
당보 고즈도 니릭직 relara di 니릭직디 투저릭 부르도 wala kuranzo pa logachini ani nirik minda charlani shigures.
These trees are something that we'll see throughout the class called a phylogenetic tree.
Di thanda Zishingdo dongbo roshtunda di zindala khaduna tun shigres.
These drawings, these phylogenetic trees, are how scientists represent the evolutionary history of species.
Di ladu nyerigi thanda pelgur gilam ni jodan jora di khande imedi an seri bai tunda dende tungu yores. Di junshin rostungu da di jodan di tungu yores shingdondi.
Let's look at a tree for something that's very easy to understand first. So here we see the evolutionary tree of cars.
Ta thanda pelgur gi dongbo jora di ro chasha na di motor yimba chashasra.
So cars were first invented and there was just one type of simple car back here.
Ta motor la chasha na thangbo go chukdu gala sawas go chukdu gala motor rikchik rang yores.
But then people developed different types of cars for different purposes. Cars for just transporting people around and cars for jobs, moving things, moving a lot of people.
Di loduda motor jala yawa cheres kunjugi. Motor rikchi kharsorla na mi yama dimdu che chibu che. Ani chik di kharcherla na chala yama ke da mi mangbu depchik la yama ore jura dinde suyores.
And then cars continued to change such that we now have cars that are very expensive and drive very, very fast and look nice, and other cars that are more practical. But they both have that same original purpose of just transporting a few people.
Chesan thanda ta jala jo rodu wala khashi motor khashi kharu sur la na khong chimbu shu dinde sugores. Ani khashi namju pheju che ro cha deures. Dila de korani ga lega che kharna na chikba res di kharchu urna na mi khashi ji yama kirin che jora yama ore di lega chikba cha deures.
And over here we see that trucks have also specialized into trucks to carry lots of goods and trucks to carry lots of people.
Ta thanda ngajo trucker lantila di ro cha shoina ra. Ani di korana la ya yawa che res chela losu mi do su res di kharcha urla na truck khashi gi thanda chala ore ran che thanda motor khashi gi truck che khashi gi mi mangbu dep chil ore dinde chini yawa che de res.
And obviously cars and trucks are not evolving because they're not alive, but the concept of watching them change over time is the same.
Ta thanda korani ga cheso da yo mares ra keme mara di ni ga ine thanda jodang gi khol lendan di chiko dugo res tujo le du gal gyo khandi dugo me jodang jure di jodang di chikpa res.
Now when Darwin came out with his theory and he looked through the fossil record and saw old organisms, people began to wonder, why don't we see a car that looks like this, right? Why don't we see an animal in between humans and chimpanzees?
Dila do semje dosta du wala di kilo yo do jora di thungu do sine ta pesha na mida thada pure chimpanzee le jo dini gi phargi semje jora di khajin toya malan di theory gi res.
The answer is that we do, you just have to know where to look.
Di yo res lendi ine nganzu kho ta da ta sa kho ta gu me di ta da ha gu res.
So we can take two different species that look very, very different. People and whales, for example.
Ta thanda semje ni lembainas pat mindo ni lembainas chik di mi chabi res. An chik di cha sha na thanda whale nya chen ro ra nya ta mari ne nya chen la ming sha da nya chen whale di cha shanas.
They look so different, you might wonder, how could they possibly have come from the same ancestor species?
Dilo du ta du gala bat mindo ra loga cha de du gala diniga mebo chik imba khandesta ngozo stamlo na le khabu chabi resti.
And while they do have a lot of differences, they also have a lot of similarities that they both inherited from their ancestor.
Dilo du gala mindo echa mangbu yores thana shi mebo chik ni yong rela di thanda digi ani dawe cha yang yores kuranila.
Both breathe air, both give birth to live babies, both have eyes that can see well.
Ta cha sha na khari lana niga khachik lana manzo uk chingop chidu lung lingyo ra di lingyo res niga thana shi mi gyo res an tu tugu ke jora khadu gonga yuni mai ba tugu khadu ke di yores nikola.
And when we look at the underlying structure of the whale, we can see even more similarities than we can from just the surface.
Ta thanda ruba quran latta oinas dile tawecha manga thungu res ngaroi.
We see similarities in our bones, and we also see the remnants of legs.
An thana shi chi khari thungur la oina di ya wel dina cha sha oina nyama kangba yo agil hangma rojora di dinal yores.
We can also see the remnants of legs on snakes. Some species still have itty bitty legs left.
Dile da kangbe da remnen lan hangma ro la wara shuru di thanda manzu duna like thoya res de chunju yores.
That is because both whales and snakes and humans evolved from an ancestor that had 4 legs.
Kais na du che ani whale di che mi che chama mebo ching ni thwe res mebo di khar lan kangba yonge cha du res.
Snakes evolved to lose all their legs. Humans evolved to have some as legs to walk on and to stand upright and get 2 arms.
Pelgu du chi du gala du rig di khachi lana kangba di ma me cha da jala chunju cha da diru mi imba ina kangba di rangja de ani thana shi ya khatu la che ani lakwa ni yo din de pelgu du res.
So we believe that as the snake continues to evolve, its species eventually will completely lose this leg because it's of no use to it anymore.
Ta thanda pelgu do de du gala thande chari ma na kangba di chunju dio res trila ta pelgu thande mi thuni du ras di do du gala di kangba di me wa chai res khaina na di phejo yo maras di rimbej konen jala thuzur rimbus jala me wa cha du res.
And since it takes energy to grow legs, you will eventually lose them since you don't want to waste that energy for something that you don't use.
Ta di ro cha sha na di phejo yo mares phejo me na ta di kangba ju yo na kangba di chalong che ya ni ba phejo chi u ki ge res su bu ta khesi di mo thanda di cha she di phejo chi me wa na an jala khali su bu ni me wa cha du ge res.
Now you might ask, do humans have things that we no longer use and we just have because we had them from our ancestor?
Ta nganzo lai thanda du na kangba di phejo yo mara di ro nganzo lai mi su bu na lo yo res ni del ha ma de ta nyema ngaran zo me bo lo yo che thanda me wa yo re. Yes, we have.
Yeah. What do they think we have?
Khari res on nyema me bo lo yo che thanda me wa ngama tail
Yes.
res.
Yes, humans still have a little bit of a tailbone left over from our ancestor that had a long tail.
Nyema me bo ni hama ju ra ngaran zo mina ta wa inege thanda ngama de ruba chunju chi yo res.
We also have some other behaviors that we've inherited from our ancestors but don't serve a purpose now.
Ta thanda di me ba ya shi jo shimba ya yo res thanda phejo ma chi ba ine nyema me bo gap su yo me bo ne chu le wa di khare tamso our wisdom teeth
Yeah, the wisdom teeth, true.
and the rest na gula appendix.
Yes, the appendix, right? And we also, when you get scared, does your hair stand on end?
Nganzo shinang do lang chi du gal ani di khare labe phabu din su ya pu din su lang dos.
That doesn't help us. It doesn't scare anyone away from me when my hair stands on end. But it certainly helped our ancestor. When they were scared, their hair would stand on end and make them look big and scary.
Ta nganzo imba na shedu gal pu din su lang dos. Ne ngaran so la khare la na kheben kheyo mares pu di lai di. Ine nyama mebo do ta wa na koran su do cha sha wa na shinang da ngang la du gal pu din su lang yo res. Pu din su lang du khare la na phajo simje di ko chimbu do shinang so chimbu do thong yo res.
So these things are living evidence that we can see of the process of evolution.
Tinju chama ta nganzo ta pelgu du yo la ni pangda na chi yo res.
In fact, when we look across all mammals which we're related to, we see very similar structures in our bones.
Ta tanda nganzo nyeri dige nye yo res la ni shi yo res. Dinal ma ta wa na koran su gi tanda rube gi chago jora di an ta u cha yo res.
And through the process of evolution and a long period of time, these same structures can evolve to serve different purposes and they can change to be quite different.
Tanda chago jora di rangja che ine koran zo tuzo rimbe do du kala phejo chidang loga dinde chago yo res.
So when we look at the bones in our arms and our hands, which we can use to work with tools, We see the same bones in the legs of a cheetah, in the fins of a whale, and in the wings of a bat.
Di rota migi thanda labe ruba cha shawana chakui de dinde cha deures din soma do cha deures di sik che di nya che wel di che di phawong druda tin zu res ine onzo mi imba ina khari pheju chigir lawana chala lakcha din zu juye pheju chigir res chakui ta waina ibgu din ta waina do cha deures sim je shamba nyam do ine pheju lo cha deures.
So in these pictures, the bones of the same color are the same bone in the different species.
Di ladu thanda ruba de chiknang da changse doj denzo rig de khari lawar lana ruba rig chikba imba tung res ine nyeri lo cha de res.
So we evolved fingers which were very dexterous. We can move them quite easily to do many different things. The cheetah evolved them to become a paw which it could push off the ground and run very fast.
Di ladu ta ngazo mi imba ina thanda zugu ruba jora dende res ani thanda di sig rig imba ina chawdan dende cha de res manzo di khari yor lana yogo che gujo ta le lo res laksa din peju chi ura di le lo cha de res khran zo imba na juge la phingi res ruba chawdan dende cha de res.
The whale evolved its fingers bones to be very long and strong so that it could glide its way through the water.
Di ladu khran zo di ruba di cha sha na nya che wel na di ruba de ringbu chi cha de res di ki khari phingi la na khunzo gyaso na di dugal chuna ya ma dwe di phingi res.
The bat evolved its finger bones to be very, very light and thin and spread out to build this very lightweight wing so that it could fly.
Ta phawang do cha sha na di rubash ta di ani yangbu shu res yangbu che tham de ju res di ge ani thanda shokba de ju tham ni ani yangbu che ani lungnal ya phur ya ma phur gu res dil phing res.
So this is strong evidence that we all came from the same ancestor, even though we look very different.
Manzo ta du gala mindo shu yo ai nes dinzu ki khari pangda di khari chagi la na ngaro ju sangma mebu chig ni le re la jora timong gi mebu yor lan di shi res.
Scientists also believe that the Earth itself looked very different a long time ago, and the continents that we know today to be spread out across the ocean once were together.
Ta thanda onzo se khola ta ne lingthe mangbu ju di ngema ta na mindo yores ngema dondo chig yor lan di shi yores thanda tham de ra.
And when we look at how the animals are spread across these continents that are very far apart now, we see that regions that used to be close together, we see the same fossils and similar species.
Thande tadu wala lingthen de tharu shu thonggu yo ainas yema khari yor la na lingthen ni zo nyu yo kapsu ta ngazo jurdo tadu wala ne denzo nyu chadu wala denzo jurdo denzo nya thonggu yo res ta yo res.
But as the continents spread apart, these animals, once separated, were free to evolve into different species.
Dila do lingthen di ya tharing ro do wala semjen de je khoran zo ni saja lo chadu wala khoran jo gi thana phelgu do dan dige ani mindo do res.
We can also see an organism evolve into different species even when they're not separated by an ocean.
Ta thanda sai sagui tha chon tha chani ta waina loga cha irlan shera dijibu mai ba sagui chigla digi yo ina ge phelgu ro yo res point.
So here we see all these different types of salamanders that, although close together, they live in very different environments, and that causes them to evolve differently.
Ta changba jeli ri do salamander la jure di do ta waina ges khronzo khuryu mindo yo res desa dil ta ne ani khronzo tadu wala mindo yo res salamander rigla.
So salamanders that live up in the mountains have a different environment. They need different tools to survive well. So they would evolve to be different from salamanders that live down on the sea level.
Ta thanda salamander di rigal dingi rig di cha na khoronzo khoryu la pa beda khoronzo subwe chagyo de lagja lai da di lagja mindo yo di la thanda tyen che de lagja mindo che ani pelgur mindo do rest da phya na shi di da duru na khorani loga cha de res so khoryu la pa be cha yo res.
So evolution helps us biologists understand why and how we have all these beautiful and very different creatures on Earth.
Che zan da ngu se ko la ga ta na Greek mindo semju Greek mindo mangbu shush ningju mangbu shush thoy di khandes re la na thanda phelgu review ne ngu se u chagi res.
And the beauty and how well it worked with our observations excited scientists a lot, and they wanted everybody to understand evolution.
dila du cheri ba khoranzo gi da tokship chung khari ni image ra di ani shin sangma gi di ko di lenchue di cheri ba khoranzo gi nangyu res.
But as I mentioned before, not everybody did because they did not like that it connected us so much with other animals.
Ina da changme gi di ngolen chi gi yoro la na yo maris khashi gi da mi da simje shimba ba dewa cha gi yoro la wa na khunju gi ngolen chi tu yo mares.
And one argument those people make against evolution is they say that we must have been created by a god because we are so perfect.
Ta khunju khari shi gi yoro la wa na mi la di da shuj ya bu shu yoro la ni kheba wa shuj res takta yores la di la du gala ni yang tha ba ji res di ge ni konjo gi dup sha gyo so sha gyo ji re la ni la gi res khunju gi.
But scientists, when we look at humans, we do not see perfect creatures. In fact, we don't believe in perfect creatures. We just believe in creatures that are well evolved and very well adapted for their specific environment.
Ta cheri bai ta dan sho na kengyo khande ji bai na gi yang tha balan di shi yo mares. Quran zo khande jil shagur la na kengyo den zo soso gi khorug la du yaksho tin tu du lai jora di shi yo res. Dun dang dil tan gi shi yo res.
One example of our imperfection is the fact that humans have to use the same tube to breathe and to swallow their food.
Ta na shi mi ro cha sha na mi ngon zo thanda se sa da uk tong len che jora di la ngon zo thanda subu nang lo la phugu yo res.
So as we swallow our food, it travels down our throat. And since this is the same tube we use to breathe, that can be a problem.
Di la du se de ge ra de gya sa ni phugu chi gi bai nas ta uk tong len che da se dre jora phugu chi gi bai na de ni ma de chi la dro na kangi thi ros.
Sometimes the food might get stuck in somebody's throat and they can't breathe and then they die. That is far from perfect.
Dila dual kabre kharchi urla na phuga chi la du wala mikpa la ga ani uk tong len chi ma tu ani thongi yo ros. Dila du wala yang tha ba ji mares.
And of course, that's not how it has to be. Dolphins, who are related to, for example, have evolved to separate their mouth, where they eat their food, from their breathing hole.
Dila du thanda dolphin chi da nya chen dolphin di ro cha sha na kunzu gi di se sa sa gi ne di kha di de cha de res uk tong len chi sa di res ne lo res ni.
So this is one example of how scientists believe that we are not perfect, and in a way to argue against people who believe people were created to be perfect by a god.
Dila du cheri pai di khelen chi yo mares mi lai draw mi lai di shu yang tha bai ba che dinde chi ani konjo gi so sha jor lani cheri pai khelen chi yo mares di samju di.
But perhaps the strongest evidence for evolution comes from when we actually make evolution happen.
Ta thanda pelgyur chungi yore la di ta peso yakshu so so chagi yores so so pelgyur dro de yoros di peso yakshu chagi yores.
So a long time ago, humans became friends with wolves and they domesticated them and began to breed them for different purposes or appearances, and now we have a wide range of dogs.
Dila du wala nyama na ngamo do shasha na thanda mi da changi ni nyam do di chi na la nya go zu ani dene ni quran zo te jora pha zu poda mo te dang di loga chi ne ani thanda thong dang min do thong di khiri ji do dende chung res per gyu ro dang di.
In England, people would breed sheep. And in England, they separate my sheep from my neighbor's sheep with a stone wall, which is difficult to build.
Ta inyo ro cha sha na su su luk da ani thongba khimse jora digi luk ni paral ma de che du quran zo khari su la na sikba doi sikba su she res.
So people really liked sheep with short legs because with short legs they cannot jump high enough to get over my wall.
Ta quran zo sikba di su du wala luk den zo kangba rimbu yo ga yo ma res quran zo kangba thundu yo luk la ga chi res khaila na sikba di gang ya chung tu yo ma res.
So people, each generation, when they picked the sheep they wanted to breed, they picked sheep with short legs.
Dila du quran zo ida damgura luk nal damdu kala mi din zo khari damgur la na luk kangba chung ari din zo damgu res.
So when they picked the sheep with the short leg genes would be passed on to all the babies, and the next generation would be just a little bit shorter than the previous generation.
Dila du luk damdu kala quran zo luk kangba thunga yo damgu res ra di indul kangba thunga din zo quran zo phati ra di te du kala lugu chungura lugu din zo dila kangba chunga di rigze di ma du res di ma lugu chungyo din zo rigze de lugu chung thanda lugu chungju din zo kangba ta na dila chunga yo res nyama thanda rigu ngoma di durwai nas.
So doing this generation after generation after generation, we eventually evolved sheep with short legs, and you only need a very short wall to contain them.
Dilado user dundu chigijel chig ma rigze di ma tangdu gala kangba chungru dugures and jela career lana chigba di tho shu gyam go adinde chayres look denju ma thewaina nchu kangba chungju rig dinde chadures tamadel.
We've also controlled the evolution of some other animals that we interact with.
Thana she semje shimbala yanganju gita thanda tangsin chero ra pelgyur gilam ni ro chadures chik.
This is what chickens looked like in 1957, in 1978, and in 2005.
Ta chikdong gubjang abjung abdin ro tawaina chade denju khande yor lawaina dinde res chamudes. Ani di chikdong gubja denju dengila dinde res. Ani nidonga la dinde res.
You can tell that the chicken farmers, each generation, picked the chickens with the biggest breast meat to give birth to the next generation. So now we have these chickens with huge breast meat.
Diladu wala tanda chade ge chonggengi rigjora shingbo deju khunzu kharchilana chade shamanga yu rigjora deju damgres an deju nyam phinju deju digjela ya rigyu chima rodu gal jelta thingsa ta oina ta chade shamanga yu rigdenjul hadu chadu res.
So in the process of about 50 years, chickens went from weighing 905 grams to over 4,000 grams. That's more than 4 times how much they used to weigh.
Ta diladu wala longap jus do chasha oina thambo gojudu gala chade denjo jigo kya oina gram ni gubjanga yores ta tingsa ta du wala gram shidons chayores diladu wala dab shis pharsares.
We've done the same thing with turkeys. Some of them are now so big they can barely stand up.
Diladu chatter ki lejura dido chasha oina nyama chikdong gubje sumju che thingsa inde dores thingsa ta che dama che suso kangba gala laya khapu chabe res khashe.
And they have small beaks, so they can't hurt the farmers so much by pecking at them.
Diladu wala khuranju chudo ta oina ge che no shira yo mares kaina na shingba denjolo so ma ye chili.
And their wings are also smaller, so it's harder for them to fly away.
Ani khuranju shokba ta oina ge shokba chimbu shira yo mares chunju yores phuni droma thue tinde chadu yores.
So that's another example of humans controlling the evolution of a species to make them better for us.
Ta di kharit chadu lana thanda rodan shida mi gita thanda phelgyur la tangjin chisha yu ro chadu yores mi suso la kheben yo chedu.
Similarly, cows are another species that people have used to breed. Cows used to have a wide variety of shapes, sizes, colors. We've bred them to all be the same now.
Ta phaju ro cha sha oina ge yang anjo tedang jura mi shingba de dile chini ya ngema cha sha oina rig mangbu shu yores ta oina ta dene ni thanda khunju shingba damgi chini ma de ju da dinde gi ani phelgu ro dan tangjin chini thingsa ta de phaju ta oina rig chik ro cha de yores.
You can see milk cows we've bred to be able to produce a huge amount of milk every day.
Diladu thingsa da phaju ta oina numa den che ani oma mangbu shu tentunge dinde phaju ri cha de yores.
We can do the same thing with plants. We have also evolved plants for our own purposes.
Thana shi ya phelgyur dra chishing de ya susu kheben che de ya koran su ge phelgyur la tangjin che yores mi.
There's a huge diversity of plant species on this planet, but humans use a very, very small number to eat.
Diladu thambo gozo du chishing rig mangbu shu yores ya mi susu sa che de ya dine ni chishing dam yores koran su ge.
So some of those you can see here are wheat as it used to be, and wheat today, much fatter, much bigger. You get a lot more food from the same amount of land now.
Diladu di thingsan gi tro di res ra di nang nyama ta na tro den de jores ya mi din zu gi ya da che de zo dam ni ya de chini thingsan ta na tro ri khar cha de la na sa ya ma yo de ri dik tung gi res.
Tomatoes used to be small, and farmers have evolved them to have huge, big tomatoes for our purposes, not for the benefit of the plant.
Ya mi susu kheben che de chishing di kheben che de mare susu kheben che de ya tanda tomato nyama cha sha na diga shunju yores ta thingsa ta na jedang di te jora di shingba gi dinde chimbu rang tungu rest insa.
And nuts. Used to be small, you had to work hard to get to have enough nuts to be full. Now we've made them much bigger.
Tega na shu du rig jora de nyema ta na chunju res. Ta te chen tingsa khari la na du che rig tungu res.
Okay, so we've taken you through some evidence for why scientists believe in evolution. We thought it might be interesting to now take you on a journey back through time to see how evolution has unfolded.
Ta thanda peldur la ke shi bi pangda la ke shi res. An pangda la du ta khiran sol thanda thujo ni ma chimbaina ani thanda pangda di ko se u chag res.
Okay, so this is a video of how scientists imagine life has evolved on Earth.
Ta thanda di nyinti thanda longi stung res di thanda khari tungu la na cheri bo de juida thangbo cheso khande dubi me samlo jora samlo khidan di tun res.
And it's also going to give you an idea for time. So in this video, you'll see a clock. This is as if the history of the Earth happens over a 24-hour period on the clock.
And ta thanda di longi stung ra di cha khari sha la na chuzu ni chapshi nal sai khula ita lo yu do ji tun sha res.
So the Earth forms and the continents form, and life begins at about 4 a.m. on our clock.
Sai khula res ra andi gal lingten de cha res. Chuzu ni chapshi nal ma tun sha res di.
We see single-cell life evolve.
Dila du thabung dawe ta cheso ro thangbo phejur chudang di tun res.
At about 1 p.m., we see the first eukaryotic cells appear.
Ta thanda chuzu thangbo ningu jab chuzu thangbo sto chadu gala ani tening thabung de jo cha res di. Ningden thabung de jo.
We think eukaryotic cells evolved when one cell ate another cell.
Ta ningden thabung de chawdang hande chayar la ni samlo ta oina khujui khari shigur la oina thabung chi gi thabung shimba sawa na shi tinde chi res.
And the cell inside of the bigger cell evolved to just hold the genetic material, the DNA, and the cell around it evolved to provide all the nutrients and the metabolism to support that.
Ta thabung che gi chunga sawa do cha sha res la ra ani chunga di kharchir la na rigje nyangit cha ani che digi ma thanda chuze thanda zeri jora di ma tinge de cha de res.
Okay, so the Earth started at midnight. Life started not until 4, and now it's 6:30 at night. It's supper time, and we are still just have single-celled organisms on the Earth.
Ta thanda thuju gochuk dang de khani gochuk la ne chi chuju chungi jo de ne gochuk res ra sai kula chai di an de ne ni chuju thanda shiwas la ani thabung thangbo do gochuk sos thanda tru da cha la du ge lai thandi shini ngo thabung kyang de ro de res.
And about dinner time is when we start to see cells come together to form an organism that's more than just a single cell.
Ani tru da cha gonda tru da cha cha du shini da thabung kyang de ni thabung mang de chai jora di gochuk res.
At about 8:30, we start to see plants in the sea.
Ani chuju gonda chuju ge de cha sto cha du gala ani chishing de jo tu be gochuk res chai.
At 8:50, we start to see animals in the ocean.
Di thama gyatso na chishing cha so di jela ani gonda chuju ge de kam chongas le du gala ani simje shimba de gochuk res.
At nighttime, we start to see animals and plants go onto the land.
Chen la ani khare chungur la na thanda simje da chishing de jo ani sai gan le gochuk res.
We see the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs go extinct just 19 minutes before midnight.
Ta chen chungi masim gol kama churgus ngwe la ani thanda tumru rich do din jo ani chadong do res.
Humans, we don't see until less than 2 minutes left.
Ta kamani slai ra da kamani le nyung su du gala ani shini midi le res.
Humans have been on the planet for the blink of an eye.
Dila du da ngonzo mitsuma na shi de chigna la ani mi chawa ji de tungu res thanda dina.
Do you want to see another video showing this?
Hengyo thanda longi de sigi imbesa. Yes.
So this one will start with the formation of the earth when it was very, very hot and there was no water and there could be no life.
Ta di sai kola thangbo cha ale nyen la tunju din na shi yan di nyen thi shemba ji di longi shemba ji res. di thangbo sa kolo go chuk du res di chao shu yu res thangbo go chuk du.
But eventually, we'll start to see rain coming down and water on the surface, which is when life and its building blocks can begin to form.
Di lo di chao phabe da di go chuk res sa kolo di gana. An dine ne an thanda ngjo seso gi dupche shije jua di da ni seso den zo dube go chuk di ke shi yu res.
And then we begin to see those building blocks building more complex structures such as RNA and DNA and protein.
Shije dupche den zo koran zo nang ku angela khali tis nyokjin ching gi dudul RNA da DNA din zo dube go chuk res.
Eventually, life evolves, and we see simple bacteria, single-celled organisms.
Jel seso la phelgyu drone an ngjo thasi bacteria tabde rik den zo chai res.
Eventually, the bacteria learned how to harness the energy from the sun.
Dilo do ni thasi bacteria di nime ni niba len jura di khandis di lendang de sheres.
Those bacteria grew into these large formations we call stromatolites, and they began to pump oxygen into the air.
Dilo do an jela bacteria thasi bacteria din zo di thanda judo riks da dinde ro di chadu res. Dinde ni khari chiur lawana thanda ngjo cholung ma chilol tuen jo di go chu res.
These bubbles of oxygen going into our atmosphere created the ozone layer, which protects the Earth from some of the radiation from the sun.
Tadi gazo nan tanda bosh tungu da di ani cholung gi bo di chadu res. Di ya ta ne ani ngjo namla tanda ozone gi rimba jora di chadu res. Di kharchi ula na ngjo nime yu tanda nugen chinge yu jora dine ne ani sungyop chigyo res.
Being protected from that radiation, now life could live more on the surface of Earth.
Dila duta sungyop di chungra ra sa jela ozone rimba dile sa jela ani seso gi mangru dro res sa khola bang.
And we start to see more complicated cells and organisms evolve.
Dila du ani seso da kengyu da nyokjin che mangru dro phelgu dro go chu res.
We would see underwater sponges that had even specialized cells. Some would move the water through them, and some would filter that water for nutrients.
Dila duta tanda sponge rig jora gasu nang la socha den dendo do cha sha ina khashi gi chu su su nang gyunin ma ta ya dinde chi yores khashi gi cha ge jora chu di nang lo chu je khari gu gu me dinde le ni cha ge nge dinde yores.
We then get anemones, which have evolved to be able to bend and flex, the first movement that we could see.
Dila do yogo chinge thangbo do dita tanda anemone la de zo cha yores gasu nang la socha den zo.
And then we see our first flatworm, which is something that can actually move through its environment.
The bulle mo rig jora dinde rig di cha yores di sai mo galani yama dunge cha yores buzindi.
This flatworm is the first organism with a very, very simple brain.
Di busin le mo sta di ro cha sha ina ta socha thangbo cha yores leba tab de yungej.
Able to, from a simple brain, control the muscles throughout its body to control its movement.
Dilo do taleba tabde jur lara digi ani subu yogu chela tangzi chigyo res.
And very simple eyes to see light and shadows and go away from predators and towards prey.
Dilo do mi ke tabde jur res tinzo socha dinala di bule mudna. Dilo do gala yim yo chola doya da yo ni doya da dinzo lega di chigyo res timna da yo di sorgyo res.
About 100 million years later, we start to see an explosion in the diversity of life. Now that there's simple brains and things can move around, we see a huge diversity evolve.
Dila don tuzo rimbe ma dudu gala thambunya la tabde leba tabde jora dine ne ani tanda cheso gi rig mando chadu res.
The diversity of life creates competition for food. So these organisms have to evolve more and more complicated ways to find their food and evade being eaten themselves.
Cheso rig manga do thana shi ani seda samarig lan dindur cheru do res dila de susu munita sedi raya thapshi chela dindur shuk cheru do res koraz nanglola.
Here's one predator that ruled the world for a while.
Dido cha shawaina ani tuzurimbu ta tuzukte chiringala korangi da so koran do cha de cha res koran tuzudina.
That's the trilobite that's in this fossil that you can come see.
Tanda socha shtonsa tanda di gyurduna yo socha di res.
Eventually, we'll start to see fish with bones evolve.
Angela khali gali ani nya ruba yongi nya dinzu pelgyur chung res.
Look at there. All the animals are still confined to the ocean, but there are plants making their way onto the land.
Ta semje sangma khol yor lawana gyasuna yores. Ne zishing denzu ta sagale gozu res.
So we see the evolution of fish with bones and jaws that can open and shut.
Thana shi da nya thanda pelgyur dodan di thanda rube nya jura denzu rigashte res.
Eventually, animal life began to move onto the land, beginning with centipedes and insects that found a way to breathe outside of the water.
An thanda jala khali gali semje denzu sagale gozu res ta thangshu do thanda cha shawana dinal kharito yor lawana bu kangya lage an riya dende rig di res. Di khuran zo semje denzu kharla na ta sagale oine lungnang lula thanda uktong len chitunge dende semje chadu res.
They developed skin to keep the water inside their bodies so that they did not just dry up when they left the ocean.
Khuran zo gi pagwa ta gyaso shani sagale ro di indu kal khunzo pagwa hande jyor lawana di nanglo chu nyar tunge shimba chu sama ma kam rura subu dende maim bache pagwa di chu nyar tunge dende rig chayo res.
Scorpions were also some of the first animals to go onto land, and they evolved into the scorpions and the spiders.
Thana she dipora za rigyo dende rig dige ya thanda sagalinge thangbu rig chadu res an koran zo pelgyu doni thanda thombu ro thomda bujya dende rig dani dipora za rig minda chadu res pelgyu chini.
The insects went onto the land to eat the plants, and now we'll see those bony fish move onto the land to eat the insects.
Ta thanda budin zo busin den zo kharchi gyur la na chishin sagala do roas thana shi busin sa chudu ya thanda nya ruba chindi busin all do res.
So some fish that lived near the edge of the water evolved these fins that could help push them through the grasses near the edge of the water, and they became more and more leg-like.
Dilo duta thanda chishin budin zo ram do go do kala quran su gi thanda shokba jura di khali gali di skangba daru do ni khain na thanda gyaso yo thaju ting jura dilani ya buni do res thala.
Eventually, those animals moved onto the land and became amphibians that still have to live part of their life cycle in the water.
Dilo do angela semje do thanda sai ngol le do gala pelgu do ni khari chagla na kamshel ni ne dende soja chadu res. Dige ani thanda sai ngoida thanda chuna ni ga ni thunge dende chadu res.
And eventually, those amphibians would evolve into reptiles, which can move further onto the land away from water, because they have a skin protection that's even better to hold the water in, and they can lay eggs that keeps their young in a wet environment.
Dilo do kamshel ni ne do ni ga la ni yor la jela pelgu do ni khali khari chagla na thanda todo semje rig di chagu res. Quran zo ipa ba hande yor la na chunya gi ni ba ya ga res. Cheza ani chuni tharing ru do res. Thana shi gonga itang yor res du.
Those reptiles at first could not move fast because their legs spread out and their lungs were here, and their movement was connected to their breathing. So if they move too fast, they get out of breath.
Dilo do Quran zo todo semje rig di thamani khari la na yogu che khabu chagu res kainan kunzo yogu che di da an uktong ne che ni ga nyam do thu di du kala yogu shu dro na uktong la kala thi res.
But eventually they evolve to move their legs down and allow their lungs to breathe regardless of whether they are moving.
Angela ta Quran so kangba den zo masala khomba pe da dinde phegu do ni khali gali rimbe ni uktong da den zo lela ro do res.
And we start seeing more and more life evolve from there to the dinosaurs, and eventually the dinosaurs go extinct, which allows space for the mammals to evolve.
Dilo do tumru den zo thangbo chung an tumru den zo chadong che di jela ani nusu semje rig den zo phelgyur chung res.
I think that's about the end. Okay. We think the first mammals were very small, like rats, and then they evolved into all the different forms that you see today.
다 단다 누수 심제라는 거죠. 간디질 당보 누수 심제 당보르디 간디 지거라나 지지로 춘주 지거레스. 데네니 아니 칼리 땡상 통해 누수 심제리 데라 펠규토레스 시거레스.
So that is a brief view of how scientists believe the history of life on Earth has unfolded.
다 단다 뭐라 뜻서 롱이디 디 가리 춘교 라와나 세리바이다 단다 펠규토단 딘데 레슬란 세소기 펠규토단 디데 레스.
This afternoon, when we come back together, you'll do an activity to also help us visualize how history of life on Earth has happened and to imagine the time scale of life.
아니 닝구 잡라 소된 저라 디가 송하라서 최고지 지그레스 디 균이 가리 하고라나 펠규 칸데 드웨메 안 투즈림 바갈 교와 가리 드웨메 딘주 상마 세우 차기레스.
So when we come back in the afternoon, could we have two groups, one in each session?
아니 닝구 잡라 페이라 디 인도갈 아니 먼저 루카니 수행이스 진짜 디 루카니 루카 친구니가 수행이스.
And we have maybe time for one or two questions if there are any.
다 단다 티와요나 티와 찍니 지 비즈두스.
아니 도저때서 단다 사이 반에 수를 이 따지 제디 도저때서 아니 따지 제가 zam이 토네다 상이 가서간 제거데 아니 지금 제기로 받아들여. 이거 상만이 유름 지어라. 지금 연구하는 것들이 있어.
So when you are taking evidence from fossils and the rocks, are you taking these evidences from a particular area or from different parts of the world?
Are we getting the fossils from one area?
From one particular area or from different areas of the world?
Yeah, scientists collect fossils from all over the world, and they always document exactly where they found them so we can understand which organisms lived in which place and at what time.
다 단다 유르도 렌단디 라 티와디 라 빵다디 유르도디 단다 세리바딘 조 심주치도 유르도딘 조 모우라디 라교딘 조 아니 세리바 창마 이냐 아니 톡고 아니 사자 카니 레이메 아니 카두 레이메 아니 투조 카가스 트웨메 조라 디 창마 콘조디 토 야기요레스.
But certain areas are better for fossils than others because most of the time when an animal dies, it's eaten and it decays and there's nothing left. It has to be the right conditions in order for its bones to be preserved inside of rock.
다 유르도 차야라 차기냐 상구요레스. 내당 딱딱지 상기요이나 아니 단다 디가 라이 타딘 조 네임 추나라 데 타기 네임 유르도 유르고라 디 교야라 내당 딱딱지 메오이나 야 유르도 디기요 마르 심바 심진디 하마디 가지르나 루두요레스. 제자 내당 딱다 요이나 아니 유르도라 마 유르요레스.
당기 주드리아도 깜빡이야 비전이 잘 돈으로 잘 해서 단다 이 장소는 신지 주도시 선물이야 돈으로 그 신지 가이는 돈 가이드를 좀 양아서 분이 참들이 무슨 지원을 받아요.
So we have seen that in snakes the remnants of leg getting shorter and shorter, right? But in the video we have seen that the legs are getting modified, right? In reptiles. So how come are these two differences?
So remember the tree of the cars, right? Some cars went this way and became bigger and bigger to transport people and goods. And some cars went this way to become smaller and faster and more compact to get people places quickly.
다 그런저 튕기 도알스 니라 모자기 탄다 페규 조당디 된 로스 조당디 디텐도 갈직 디 트럭 체직 모터 충아 된 소스 트럭 라디 코란 체르 체 미디가스 망아 쇼에 딘디기 페규 조당디 된 로스 직디 카르라나 충로 체 이네 미뇽아 키에체 겨우로 줘요 요 딘디 페규 조당시 된 로스 모자니디.
So some reptiles may have not needed their legs and so they started to lose them, but other reptiles needed those legs to survive, so they kept them.
제자 또로 심지 카시 가리치얼라나 딘주 구구 메산 칼리 메어 차두고 레스 차시든 카시를 구구 여자 디 야르게 두고 레스.
And it just depends on their environment which would be the most successful.
딜라도 갈라 코란 주기 코리올라 라르게 레스. 심지는 주기.
단단히 저도도 그런 것들 모두 다시 찍어놔요. 근데 로세 대신에 저도 생각도 저도 소도 데데데데 다시 찍어놔요. 다시 그 간을 땅땅 그랬어.
Lots of countries la thu yore so you determine the age of fossils. So how do you get this age?
That's a good question. So there are certain atoms that are radioactive. And so when rocks are formed, they're trapped within them. And we can measure the level of radioactivity left, and we know how quickly that radioactive activity decays.
Dila dugala tanda simje dizul hangma shujira yurdo dizul nang khari lan dudin yoras an dudin kashi ri khari la na kedri rangshi chen yores kedri rangshi chen la dugala dudin dizul khagas ta se ro la ora dige la na myo chadre dinde gi ani quran chu gi che yores di ngaran chu gi je ni ani la thu yores.
These molecules are like a little clicking
Clock.
ticking clock, and as they tick away, you can figure out how old that fossil was.
Ta di nang lo dudul jur la ra duten da dudul dinzu tanda nganzu chuju dugda di draw nang shi kunzu khagas draw image ra thuju dudul dinzu ta ne nganzu la thu yores andi ninglo khagas reshalan dil tan la yores.
제가 토마스 소트 쪽에 담아라는 진정을 지시고 근데 이제 제가 하는 이 저널로 제가 하는 그래서 뒤에 나를 마소라는 제마한테는 이건 다 냐고 되는 편집 좀 봐서야 거기 그걸로 거기에 다들 지고 있는 이 말에서
미다냐 dinzugi tanda khulgi jodan dira chipare marisra
제가 제서부터 가서
So the evolution of fishes and humans, so is there any relation? Dewa yurwes ra horani ba rigzegi pelgurla.
토마 치차더라. 그 제가 말한 편집이 통해서 나도 토마가 만나서 차고 뭐야 이제 뭐가 되는 거야. 아주 제발에다 가시 같이 내기 차고 어떻게 아까 토마도 제가 이제 집안에 차고 아주 이제서 가는 거
So we all come from one ancestor, a single and common ancestor. So when the evolution happens, so the forms of organisms diversify. So what about so in terms of DNA, how can we say about this? So what are the differences? Is there any relationship between these two, or he wants to know in terms of DNA and RNA, molecular level?
Yeah, excellent question. DNA is another very strong piece of evidence for the fact that we're all related. So all life on Earth uses the same DNA code to the same 4 letters, and those letters are translated to amino acids using the same code for all life on Earth. Also, if you look at certain genes that we believe were present in the ancestor, so genes that are central to the survival of a cell, genes to copy DNA, genes to metabolize sugar, genes to translate to make proteins. Those genes we see in all the species on Earth.
Tanda rigze korshia inasra ta peldu jodu kala rigze so ngarazul goya jura pesha waina tanda DNA denzo tashu chiyo ras dinde chinge rigze che thaganashi ngarju rig subu nang la ngjo ge jegyur doya jura dinde chitungi rigze denzo chune la bunge gida so rigze rig denzo ngjo kengyo khande jilta waina changmana thoye res rigze di.
About a third of our genes you would find, well, no, not a third. About 300 genes you would find in any species on Earth. And if you compare my DNA to the DNA of a chimpanzee, it would be about 99% identical.
Ta simje khande jilta waina rigze sumgya sta waina ra simje khande jinata waina di chang de res chiba cha de res. Ani ngaran so do mi da chimpanzee piu ro jua chimpanzee le dini ta waina rigzel ta du gala kyaje buju gorgos chungyo res niga tau cha de res.
난다가 저 거의 진짜가 저런 놈이 있어요. 저런 놈이 그런 나로 있는 미터에 저런 놈이 인제가 미 누구 상을 놈이 말아. 저는 거의 그거는 저런 놈이 그거가 잡혀요 말아. 같이 문제가 돼 가게 되는 거. 그 이제 그 상을 내가 있는 거의 무슨 저런 놈이 인제가 딱 그런 거. 거의 저는 이거 상황에 이제 내가 또 이거 상을 줘야
So we adapt, so any organism it adapts with the environment, right? According to the environment. So how does this change happens? So we don't want to change, So how does this change happen?
That's a very good question, and we're going to talk about how evolution actually happens in the coming days. And I was told never, ever, ever to keep you past 11 o'clock. So we want to let everybody go, but we will answer your question.
Tiwadi yago dosa ane di thanda pelgyur gilam ni deshe gaya jora tiwadi khande store di pelgyur gilam ni she is ani ine thanda kiranzo zida chuchukji shela person chuchukji chagi ras di tawda la tangro cheslan she so cheza di len di jela ge is.
Okay.